Great,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to see so many of you here today, and to make time to spend some time to learn from Leah and from all of the incredible work that they've done up in North Simcoe Muskoka. As I think all, or at least most of you know, at the COE, we are have been working on developing a program-wide approach to OSP to better meet the needs of Indigenous clients and communities, and this certainly is a work in progress. I know that many of you are certainly well on your way in your NLOs thinking through this, working on engagement, already experiencing some of the challenges, and thinking through what sort of flexibility is needed within the program. So we always really appreciate hearing from you and learning from that. And I'm really thrilled that Leah Lalonde is able to join us today. And so she is going to share with us some of the work that she has done up through Waypoint in North Simcoe Muskoka with the OSP pilot. And so I will introduce Leah to you. Leah Lalonde is a registered MSW with a specialization in Indigenous trauma. She completed her graduate studies at the University of Toronto. And so Leah is with Mamawe Widokdoin, and she is currently a member of the counseling and wellness team providing trauma therapy that's heavily influenced by a land-based course-supported approach that's culturally aligned. Leah is also the lead on Mamawe's course-supported wellness program, and she's also been the Indigenous lead on the Ontario Structured Psychotherapy Program since its early introduction in North Simcoe Muskoka. And so we're really looking forward to learning more from Leah, and looking forward to I think she wants this to be a very interactive session and to hear your thoughts and feedback throughout. So I'll pass it over to you, Leah.
Thanks so much, Laura, for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And thank you, Kendall, for supporting me with technology today. I just wanted to say before we get started, I'll kind of work backwards maybe here, but so I just want to really make it very clear that this work is not mine, but it's mine to share today. That this was created as a collective and in partnership between several different Indigenous agencies in North Simcoe Muskoka, and in partnership with the NLO there, Waypoint. So they've been our amazing partners and really supported the growth of this program. And I just want to give a little bit of an update now about where we're at. So I'll share with you some of the steps we took to engagement and some of the fundamental or foundational aspects of the work we've been able to do in our region. But I just want to say that at this point in time, where we are now is that in Mamawe Widokdoin, which is an Indigenous primary health care team, it's comprised of clinicians and social workers and therapists and traditional healers, cultural programming, and we all try to work together in a very integrated way. And so we've been doing a lot of work within Mamawe with our OSP program. We have 2 therapists on board, and they're really doing incredible things. They receive consultation from an Indigenous psychologist who's very well experienced, highly experienced in CBT, and very familiar with the community. But recently we've started to embark on some research evaluation work with a woman named Charity Fleming. She is she's kind of the overseer and owner of Coelia Counseling. I think they have 11 clinics and they offer CBT in all of those locations. including on Six Nations and in the Brantford area. And they are currently providing CBT therapy to approximately 300 Indigenous community members a week. So she has been very, very helpful to us in terms of determining our next steps. And our therapists are currently registered and starting a training that was developed by charity. It's called Sacred Circle CBT through Laurier University. So we've kind of come through this process, and those are our next steps. So that's where we are. I sometimes like to start at the end in case I forget what I need to share. So as Laura said, I totally welcome any questions throughout. It's a lengthy presentation with lots of information. So please don't hesitate to ask as we go along. I'm going to start here with our slide here with the name Manukmi. So when we, at a certain point throughout the development of our OSP program in North Simcoe Muskoka, we approached an Indigenous knowledge keeper who is very highly regarded and well known in our region, John Rice, and followed the appropriate protocols and asked him to please find a name for our program. So he found the name Manukmi, which means sacred tracks on the earth. And I think that when we get to a certain point in the information that I'm sharing, you'll understand the significance of the name. The name is unique to our region, and the teachings that went along with it are also unique to our region. All right, Kendall. So the whole approach we took, and again, I just want to say here that this is not, what I'm about to share is not at all about here's a pathway to follow to adapt OSP. It's not that. What it is an overview of steps we took to develop highly effective relationships so that we could work together with our mainstream NLO waypoint in a very balanced way, and applying the concept of two-eyed seeing. So two-eyed seeing was shared by a Mi'kmaq elder who teaches that to be able to provide or develop quality relationships and programming that are involving Indigenous communities and mainstream services, that we have to take a two-eyed seeing approach, where from one eye we're integrating Indigenous worldview and cultural approaches to healing that are also overlapping or integrating through the other eye with information from westernized approaches to mental health care. And so you'll see in the middle of the Venn diagram with the two eyes coming together, that in the center, we work to really establish this understanding that you'll see it says IASP, because when we started, the program was referred to as Increased Access to Structured Psychotherapy, not OSP. So that was the first year pilot. So the whole program and everything we did is foundationally based on this concept that an approach of two-eyed seeing is essential, that we can't just be following a mainstream approach as Indigenous service providers, that there has to be a lot of engagement to be finding this middle road. and also really honoring the Indigenous expertise and experience and insight into how we do adapt and work together to develop those quality relationships between clients and therapists, but also through the partner organizations. All right, Kendall. So the information to be shared is about the first year of the pilot project. And so we were really working very hard during that time to figure out our relationship. And within North Simcoe Muskoka, we understood that, or it's understood that there are unique mental health and wellness needs of the Indigenous community. We have the fourth largest Indigenous population out of all of the, I think that was a kind of a number that was, it's third highest now, proportionate population in Ontario. So I think that those numbers were determined based upon the local health integration network system. So that's relevant here in that we're meeting the needs of a very large population of Indigenous community members, very varied. So large urban Indigenous population, 4 First Nations communities, and I think there's it's the largest Métis settlement out of all of Ontario as well in our region. So there was a clear understanding that the program had to be distinct. Okay, Kendall. So when we were developing at the center of everything, you'll see here one of the 4 sacred medicines of the tobacco leaves. And these are not my teachings to share, that I usually leave those teachings to the Indigenous knowledge keepers or healers or teachers. But I just want to highlight that the tobacco leaves are there in the center of these 3 areas of Indigenous worldview, the Western CBT protocols, and ensuring access to service, with the intention of bringing those 3 things or 3 areas together. So when we talk about the importance of relationship, it's necessary to really understand the existing relationship that was already there and fairly well established between Waypoint and the Indigenous Health Circle of North Simcoe Muskoka. So the Indigenous Health Circle is a recognized health planning table in our region that has had over 20 years of really good work coming together and developing many different programs and working in partnership with the LIN and other partners just like Waypoint. And there had been several opportunities for Waypoint to work with the Indigenous Health Circle on other projects and research opportunities and all kinds of great things. And we have had that relationship with Waypoint for probably the last 7 years now. And they provide lots of opportunity to meet and to consult, but absolutely every year we have larger biannual or twice a year meetings where we come together and really look at the quality of mental health services in general that Waypoint is able to provide to the Indigenous community. And the reason why I bring that up is because I believe that the reason why we were able to make so many great gains and move ahead in such a meaningful and powerful way is because that relationship had already been established. And that takes time and takes a lot of effort. I really want to acknowledge Waypoint and their team for their sincere efforts to create ethical space, to bring the Indigenous Health Circle and the Indigenous community in to really have these deeper discussions. It's that and two-eyed seeing are two of the primary primary concepts that have really helped us to be successful. Okay, Kendall. So this diagram just gives a little bit of a pathway showing how we've been able to move along in the trajectory of things. So the IASP project was developed under Waypoint, and there are some Waypoint people on the call. So if I get any of this wrong or I'm missing pieces, please feel free to interject. So the IASP project develops under Waypoint. And then through our working relationship, the Indigenous Health Circle is informed about this, and we form our IASP working group. And that moves towards the working group of, so the IASP work moves away from the broader group of the IHC, and we develop our own working group that are member organizations that are also a part of the IHC. So the member organizations were the Anoctic Healing Lodge, Mama Wewita Doctowin, Basani Bamadswin, CMHA Mental Health, and Chigamik Community Health Center and Waypoint. So there were 5 partners. So it moved through this process where then the working group was very focused on those 5 groups. So those would be the Indigenous service providers and the NLO. Okay, Kendall. So if you kind of think about the two-eyed seeing model, so we have the NLO over here, you know, kind of working independently as a non-Indigenous organization with very clear framework and structure, because it's the increased access to structured psychotherapy program. And coming together with the 5 organizations initially was a big undertaking, because there are 2 different ways of walking in the world. The mainstream approach and then the Indigenous organizations are looking at this very structured program saying this is not going to work for the community for a variety of reasons. And so we were really having to move through those challenging times of trying to figure out how we were best going to bring all of this big body of work together and create a pathway forward. So in the beginning, it was decided then that it was too much work for people to be kind of doing off the side of their desks, and it needed a little bit more of a targeted approach and somebody to really be keeping things all on track and identifying the needs through a collaborative approach and documenting, etc. So in the beginning, an Indigenous co-lead role was developed. So that was the role that I took on. And as the Indigenous co-lead, I worked in partnership with the Waypoint co-lead at the time, who was helping with program development, and then facilitating the knowledge sharing and developing of a community of practice for the therapists to all come together to share their insights, the Indigenous therapists to come together. So those are 2 aspects of that role. Really important role if you can, you know, look at that as a good starting point, maybe in your NLOs. In our region, after that was kind of developed, or the need was identified and then the role was developed, one of the partner agencies funded it. And it was funded as a short-term project. And I think at this point in time, we're getting now to a place in our process where we can now kind of absolve that a little bit, because the therapists are so well versed, and we have Charity on board doing some of her evaluative work. So I think now that we kind of have a good pathway going, that co-lead role is kind of going by the wayside. This is here as knowledge brokering, but sometimes I just want to highlight Jermaine Elliott. She's our executive director of Mama Way We'd Adopt Win. And I so appreciate her as a leader. She's such an insightful and wise woman. And she wouldn't use the word knowledge brokering, I don't think. I think she would probably use a term of almost like translator, you know. As somebody who had worked in corporate and in the medical field, and understanding the expectations of mainstream programming around deliverables and outcome and data collection and all those types of things, and meeting your targets, and then trying to communicate, you know, or navigate that while working with the 4 Indigenous service providers. We had to find a middle ground. So it was about, I could understand very clearly when the CBT therapists were really struggling with the protocols and the structure, and then was able to kind of break it down and articulate it to a waypoint in a way that we could find a solution or come to a compromise or figure out how are we going to address that. So it did a lot of that, and that led to capacity building between the teams and with Waypoint in understanding like some of the cultural differences and the different ways of working, and also understanding the needs of the community a little better. You know, complexity of client presentation from trauma-informed perspective, and really starting to identify how to work with the community and the other resources in the community, the Indigenous resources in the community effectively. All right, Kendall. So a couple of slides back, I touched on community of practice. This is another really important development in our work, was being able to bring the Indigenous therapists together in a group format to really be able to talk about their experience in delivering the IASP program, what was working, what was really challenging, what needed to be changed. And as the co-lead, I facilitated those community of practices, but it wasn't, there was no psychoeducation there was no educational component. I wasn't trying to impart any information about CBT, but it was more about really deeply listening to the CBT therapists about what the struggles were that they were facing, and then documenting those very clearly so that we could bring them to Waypoint to talk about how we were going to address them. So also through the community of practice, this particular model and visual was visioned by the group and brought together and agreed on. So I'll just walk you through it. So in the middle, what we see represented here in this picture or visual of 2 people sitting together in like a lodge healing type of environment is reflective of the therapist client relationship, and really highlighting the importance of relationship. So that's everything. Without a relationship, you can't especially with working with Indigenous clients, if you can't establish a connection, then therapy is just not going to work, whether it's structured or there's a pathway to it or not. So there's this real emphasis and importance placed on supporting the therapist in developing their relationships with their clients in ways that they know they need to take outside of the protocols. And what we have going around in the spiraling out from that relationship is this beautiful braid of sweetgrass. And there's lots of different teachings. And again, I just want to acknowledge that these are not my teachings to share in their entirety. But when in your own regions, you know, your partners or potential partners, they'll come up with their own models. You can share what we've done and they can take it or leave it. But it's really important that these things be organically kind of developed in collaboration with your partners. But for us, the sweetgrass is another one of the 4 traditional Indigenous medicines. And it holds many teachings. One of the teachings is that, you know, it's a medicine of kindness and sweetness. So it was about bringing some sweetness to the relationship that's happening here. And like I said, many other teachings. It's very strong. Sweetgrass is long and strong, and when it's braided like this, it's almost impossible to break. So I would encourage you, if you ever have an opportunity to hear a cultural teaching from a healer or a traditional teacher, to really deeply take this in, because it's important and meaningful. So it's spiraling out. The energy of this relationship is spiraling out here to the bigger circle of the relationship between the NLO and the partners. So there was a clear understanding that the relationship between the therapist and the client is only as healthy as the relationship between the NLO and the partners. So that energy spirals out and it informs the larger relationship, and the larger relationship energy spirals in. You see here Indigenous worldview, cognitive behavior therapy protocols, and Western approaches are woven in here. And so that energy of the external relationships is flowing in and supporting this relationship development between the practitioner and the community member there in therapy. And then along the sweetgrass braid is like our path of steps that we took. So as we go in from this direction, the first bead here represents the development of the Indigenous Working Group. And then the second bead represents the point on the pathway where we realized, or there was an understanding, that the role of the Indigenous co-lead had to be developed. And then the second or the third bead representing productive partnerships. So the partnerships between the 4 Indigenous organizations and Waypoint. And then in here was the introduction of clinical consultation and mentorship. So this is above and beyond the typical IASP or OSP clinical supervision through the program. These are Indigenous professionals. As I mentioned earlier, Dr. Marlene Levine, I think I mentioned it. If I didn't, I'll just say now that for Mamawewi to Doctwin, Dr. Marlene Levine, she's an Indigenous psychologist, very experienced in CBT. She provides clinical consultation and mentorship to our CBT therapists in addition to their OSP supervision. And Basani Bamadzwin, they have a working relationship with Dr. Ed Connors. He's also an Indigenous psychologist, and he provides some support to that particular team. And then along the way, when we started to realize that there were gaps in understanding, we tried to develop some documentation for our mainstream partners to really understand where we were coming from. So one situation that was a really difficult stumbling block in the beginning, but we've worked through it, was when the Indigenous therapists were asked to ask their clients to record sessions. And we all understand, professionally that that's often an important part of supervision so that we can improve our skill and our ability to work well with clients. But there was an immediate concern about that, and very rightfully so, based on the history of the clients that we're working with and the lack of trust already in mainstream services or non-Indigenous service providers, medical models, and the ongoing impact of colonialism and neo-colonial policies. We decided that what we would do is we would create this companion document that gave a little bit of historical perspective. A lot of it was based on research from the Commission that was relevant to Indigenous community needs, and identified some of the barriers around that and different ways of interacting with clients that may be helpful. And so that really improved or strengthened the relationship between the working group, the Indigenous Evaluation Circle working group, NLO representatives and community representatives, so they could find a common ground to meet in the middle. So those are really important steps. Instead of them being like stumbling blocks and no, we're done, we can't do this, we really had to try to find ways to navigate it. And that's the emphasis on two-eyed seeing and relationships as medicine. The relationship is so integral to be able to continue on. And then the blue bead, or the last bead here, so far, we can add more beads now because we're doing other work, but the last bead there was the community of practice. And again, I can't emphasize enough the importance of that community of practice, because that is where all of the real depth of adaptations that needed to be made came from that group. It was documented, and then we were able to provide recommendations to Waypoint, and then they were able to work with us. When we knew what we wanted, then they were willing partners in the adaptation process. Okay, Kendall.
Leah, I just want to draw your attention. There's one question in the chat around the components of these relationships. Did it also include individuals with lived experience, or was it the service provider partners directly?
It was the service providers directly. We haven't gotten to a point yet where we have gathered community member feedback, I don't think. There might have been a process or a feedback process started, but we haven't been able to gather any of that information yet. But no, they were not involved at that point.
Thanks, Leah.
I think now is a really good time. I think the relationship between the NLO and the service providers had to be it had to be secure first. If we were to bring community members in early on, it could have been very concerning or destabilizing to them. There were some real challenging emotional moments, especially around the way that the program is intended to be delivered when we are in its purest form when it first came to us, before we were able to navigate the discussions around adaptations and different approaches. We do use the, okay. So Jess is saying, offering an answer there. Can you read that, Kendall?
Yeah, am I unmuted still? Yes. So just mentioned that they use the OPOC to gather general client feedback, and that's inclusive of your Indigenous clients and Indigenous partners as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think our approach is kind of like a community-based participatory action research project now, in that we're navigating that as we walk it through, and really figuring out what client needs are and integrating them. Like they are actually they are informing the evolution of the program. All right. So the second step was the development. So we had the co-lead role, and then the second big piece that we embarked on was the development of a letter of relationship. So this is an approach that's been used by the Indigenous Cancer Control Unit with Cancer Care Ontario very, very successfully over the years. So it's basically about outlining in agreement between the partners about how we're going to work together going forward. And there's some really important components in that. There was for us in our region. I can't speak for every region, but sometimes in Indigenous communities, they'll call this like a relationship protocol. That how are we going to manage? How are we going to manage if there is a conflict? How are we going to sort this out if we can't figure out a way forward? And in our region, there was a heavy emphasis on a recognition of the inherent rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples as the original inhabitants of the territory, the right to self-determination, and really identifying what it meant to be working from a two-eyed seeing perspective, and the importance of relationship. So building on our already existing history of productive relationships, we were able to really expand and institutionalize, like really implement into that letter of relationship the ethical space that would be provided for the Indigenous community partners in developing and evaluating the effectiveness of the program and evolving it over time. And again, that ethical space is just so important. We can show up to a table and, you know, be included, but that doesn't mean that you know, voices are going to be heard and true inclusion and equitable access to services is going to be provided unless there is a real desire to create that space, like really open up the space to hear the dialogue and to hear the feedback. So there's been a real mutual benefit in that because it's enhanced performance for the CBT therapists working with the Indigenous organizations, and Waypoint, you know, has been able to really step into this really healthy, productive working relationship with us, where we have this constant back and forth dialogue. We meet monthly, we have updates, we share recommendations and suggestions or insights about how we're moving forward. And it's bearing out with really good results. Like we're now getting good traction, and people are benefiting from the program, and our indicators and are showing that. The outcomes are there, the data is there. So once the letter of relationship was developed, we, with the help of Dr. Ed Connors, we realized that it was important to have ceremony around this, to really bring life and spirit into that letter. We've all seen lots of documents and letters and things that get created, but then, you know, they get filed and then we forget that they exist. The letter of relationship had to come alive. You know, how were we going to really work together to continue to evolve our relationship and the good work that we plan to do? So through a letter signing ceremony, we came together, the 5 organizations at the time. And what you see here on the screen is a visual of a wampum belt that was created through oral description of the work that we had been doing and done, translated from Dr. Ed Connors to a historian in our community, Brian Charles, who is also very knowledgeable and wise on the history of wampum and wampum belts, and he recreates them. So based on the information that Dr. Connors was able to share with him, he created this beautiful wampum belt that is now housed at Waypoint, and the keeper of the wampum belt is Austin Mixamong. He's the Indigenous healer there at Waypoint. So what you see here in the middle depicted are the 5 partners, and their hands are connected throughout, but the hands on the end are intended to be open in case there were more partners, more agencies that wanted to join, and also open in terms of prepared to receive more information, more wisdom, more knowledge, more experience through participating in these relationships. And then on the ends are 2 bears, one looking to the past, to look back at that knowledge and wisdom and Indigenous or cultural, the cultural teachings, worldview, and pulling that information forward into the present day relationships and infusing that knowledge into, you know, the protocols and the approach that the CBT therapists are taking. And the other bear is looking to the future. How do we, you know, continue to bring that 2-eyed seeing approach together and take all of this culminated knowledge and wisdom, past, present, and into the future, to make those sacred tracks upon the earth when we come back to the name, right, that John Rice found for the program. There are probably some other details about the wampum belt, but that's the basis of it. Okay, Kendall. So I'll maybe pause here for a moment and ask if there are any questions right now, because we're going to move into some of the foundational program adaptations that came out of the community of practice.
So there's no new questions in the chat, but feel free to take yourself off mute and verbally ask a question, or if you're more comfortable, you're welcome to put it in the chat as well.
Okay, we'll move ahead. If anybody changes their mind and wants to ask a question, we'll come back to it. So, clients, community members coming for any kind of service, it doesn't matter, you know, who they are, where they're from. There is a a significant colonial history, and there's that's present, that's prevalent. People carry that colonial history in their makeup, in their genetic DNA. We talk about the effects of intergenerational trauma often, and again, those current day or kind of present day policies that still continue to impact and traumatize people, often when they're accessing services, mainstream services. So these are things that really need to be taken into consideration when we're developing programs and delivering programs and establishing relationships. There is a lot of skepticism and mistrust, as I mentioned earlier. And I think that when we're working with Indigenous service providers, there's a lot of awareness of that, right? And so they're trying to function, the Indigenous CBT therapists are often trying to function as an advocate, and they're working double duty, you know, to one, not only establish a trusting therapeutic relationship, but having to do that in the face of, you know, that intergenerational trauma that people carry with them, and more recent traumas. We have a lack of, or there were a lack of, Indigenous specific resources within the increased access to structured psychotherapy program. So really looking at ways to integrate that. And then also the community engagement. So we still work at that now. We have developed presentations, and one of our therapists, who is half-time therapist, half-time taking on some of the lead work, is reaching out to communities all the time to have information sessions and PowerPoints and give people opportunities to ask questions about what is OSP anyways. And I think that the socialization piece of the program is very important from the early days. For us, it didn't come until later, but I would suggest that that has to be one of the first things, is to socialize it properly in a way that is accessible and makes sense to the community. Another challenge for the therapists is caseloads. As a result of that colonial history and mistrust and trauma, that a typical caseload of when you're working in the community has to be less. You can't carry the same high number of clients in as is sometimes possible in mainstream settings, because it takes too much. To really establish the healthy working relationship, you have to really take the time and create the space for building trust through positive therapeutic relationships. Okay, Kendall. So in coming together, you know, Waypoint overseeing mostly non-Indigenous therapists and Indigenous therapists, there were differing approaches, especially from the protocols, right? The CBT protocols and the structure of it. So we had to really engage the concept of two-eyed seeing and ethical space and relationships as medicine. So those differing approaches are sometimes, you know, make for challenging conversations. And then, of course, there's always this issue of competing organizational priorities. So I know that there is always a very heavy emphasis on data-driven outcomes for mainstream organizations, and looking at volume and quantitative information. And it's just a different way of being than is often the case, is the case in Indigenous organizations, is that relationship is the most important thing. And really meeting people where they're at, recognizing those presenting challenges such as the historical trauma that people carry and experience on the daily. So while there's a balancing act having to happen here, two-eyed seeing, well, we know that we have to meet some targets. We have to do that in a very safe way that is not re-traumatizing to people, and that we're walking it through in a gentle and kind way. And then competing professional demands for Indigenous service providers. You heard when Laura introduced me that I'm providing trauma therapy as a member of the team with Momaway. I'm also still functioning in some ways as the co-lead on this work and navigating that. I am also the lead on our horse-supported wellness program that actually dovetails really beautifully with this particular program. So it's rare that our therapists are just able to focus on the OSP work. We've come a long way with that. As the co-lead, one of the priorities for me was really protecting the therapist time. So letting them manage their own time and not be required to be attending so many organizational or agency meetings and allowing them the space to really just focus on this work. But in most Indigenous organizations, that's just not the case. We're often working on multiple projects and wearing multiple hats due to the very high need and the limited funding or resources. Okay, Kendall. So back to the community of practice. What we had here was a really beautiful opportunity for knowledge sharing within the community of practice between the therapists, where they could discuss what was working for them in the program with each other, and kind of more of a team-based mentorship model rather than somebody holding the space and doing a teaching model. It was more of a supported team sharing learning model. It also strengthened the interconnectedness of the team and really provided an opportunity for all of the information to be coming together in one space and giving an opportunity for them to share their shared experiences, like not feeling so alone. I sometimes hear that with the Indigenous service providers, that the community of practice really saved them when they were struggling because they felt very isolated. They felt like they were the only ones struggling with the program and the protocols. So for them to be able to come together and really speak openly and truthfully about the challenging experience they were having working within a non-Indigenous framework was really important. And it also helped with relationship building. And I just can't emphasize enough the really important information that came out of that led to some of the adaptations, recommendations for adaptations, and for me being able to communicate effectively with Waypoint as the lead. Okay, Kendall. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that the socialization of the program, we didn't do that right in the beginning. The program just developed and then it went out as the increased access to structured psychotherapy program, not the Manukami program. So the uptake was pretty, it was a little bit flat in the beginning because people didn't really, that wasn't accessible language to people. They didn't really, it didn't resonate with them deeply. It didn't feel or look appealing. It didn't look like it was going to be culturally relevant and raise some concerns, actually. So later on in the process, we created, after we had the name and the naming ceremony, we created these rack cards that we could distribute at health fairs, using community promotions, and staff themselves used as a promotional item. So on the back of the card, let's switch to the next slide and see if it's there, Kendall. No, okay. So on the back of that card, it gives some changed language about the program, what it is, and who provides it. At the bottom of each card, there was just a blank space where CBT therapists can get their business card made into a sticker and then stick it onto the back of the card, so that we weren't making rack cards that were individual to each therapist, but they could then put their identifying information on afterwards. And this bear has traveled. We love this graphic. This graphic came from the manager, our clinic manager in Mamaway, Ryan Walsh, who's just an amazing artist. And we've had this bear recognized everywhere. So I think it's really important to be working with community partners to determine things that are really appealing to the community, relatable to the community, and to bring it all together as one kind of, one kind of bigger entity, so that it's not so fragmented. Okay, Kendall. So through the community of practice and those sharings from the CBT therapist, we identified some recommended adaptations. But again, I just want to say these are very, very basic adaptations. This is not a different model of service delivery. These are important things for the NLOs to know when they are working with their community partners and figuring out how they're going to go, because we don't have a specific model. It's about the relationship, that the structure of the process exists, but if the providers, the CBT therapists, are not able to work from a cultural lens, then it wouldn't be effective. So there's a lot of other foundational work and support that comes in around our CBT therapists. So we now have, they're now accessing a community of practice space with Charity Fleming, who is an Anishinaabe woman, and she's been practicing for many years from a cultural lens. We are bringing in traditional healers and teachers regularly, and have the therapists sit with them to be learning some of the teachings. And because we're an integrated primary care team and we're all working together, sometimes our therapists will be referring clients to the horse supported wellness program, or the traditional healing program, or the Gathering Our Bundles programs, alongside the CBT as supportive and integrated services. And I think that that's helping really make things quite effective. And more effective. And I'm just going to pause here for a moment because I've mentioned it a few times. I've talked about the horse supported wellness program, and we're working on a report right now from the last year of work that we've done. And I want to make a connection between OSP criteria and the horse work. So the horse work, I won't go into a lot of detail, but it's also very culturally relevant. The Indigenous community has had a very close spiritual relationship with horses since time immemorial. We even have a horse on our team that's an Ojibwe spirit pony. It carries the same history of the community members, in that species or breed of Indigenous horse was almost extinct, almost became extinct due to colonial policies and trying to eradicate the pony, but the pony survived. So one of the biggest things that stands in the way of this is some of my perspective and probably some clinical evidence to support it, is when people are doing the clinical intake piece of the work, there are certain things that preclude them from being able to access it. Sometimes they end up into the program anyways, but they still struggle a little bit in the beginning days with containment and pretty significant dissociation as a result of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And when that happens now within our program, where one of the CBT therapists gets a new referral and they realize, well, you know, this is a bit of a barrier for this client to be able to fully engage and to be embodied and to participate successfully in the treatment process, we will get them involved in the horse supported wellness program right away. Because what I found and what the research and evidence tells us is that it is one of the most efficient ways to help people become embodied and to really address that issue of dissociation. And I've seen it with my own eyes. So that's been a really important stream for preparing people in our trauma therapy work to prepare people for accessing OSP. So we're creating a little bit of a treatment pathway there, where we're addressing the trauma, we're helping with somatic processing and embodiment, helping people learn how to contain, self-regulate, and then move into OSP. And it flows back the other way as well. So when a CBT therapist is kind of having a little bit of a struggle, then we'll all work together, make sure that the patient or the client is prepared, and then get them back into the treatment process. All right, so I'm going to go on to some of the recommended adaptations from the community of practice. And I'm going to kind of just like breeze through them. And Kendall, please feel free to share this presentation with participants today. So typically what happens is referrals come through the NLO and then are assigned to the providers. So because in the beginning, we really wanted to get some, community members into the program to see, how we could serve them best and how we could make this program work. We changed that so that we could actually be referring directly, especially as a primary healthcare team. We have our nurse practitioners and clinicians right there, and if they are assessing, and they'll actually complete the GAD and the PHQ on an intake with clients, and if they think that they're going to meet the criteria of OSP, they'll just refer right to our counseling and wellness team, and we'll take care of that ourselves. We did go through a time period where we went back to just having the intakes coming through the NLO, because we felt like maybe There were a lot of inappropriate referrals being made where people weren't actually meeting the criteria, and then it showed that our numbers kind of showed that maybe they weren't being successful. But we've switched back now. I think we have a better concept now and more education for the clinicians about how to really refer appropriately. Another adaptation was that we really needed to adjust caseload to reflect complexity, and also I think make some flexibility on either end of the treatment process, so that there was a little more opportunity in the beginning of the treatment cycle for the therapist to take their time to build the relationship with the client before they tried to jump into more of the structured aspect of the therapy. So sometimes the treatment cycle is like slightly longer, and also Indigenous CBT therapists are managing a lower caseload, less numbers due to complexity. Really important. And again, I just have to acknowledge Waypoint for their flexibility and understanding. And that's another opportunity, right, for knowledge sharing and educating around why do we need this? And then identifying the complexity and some of the cultural approaches to really establishing healthy, safe relationships came through those discussions. Touched on that one, ensuring adequate time is available for intake and therapeutic sessions, so it has to be a little longer. And then providing self-identification script for the non-Indigenous providers. So with Waypoint, through the intake process, there's an opportunity for people to self-identify, which I think that's kind of a standard operating practice throughout the NLOs. But what we did with Waypoint was we created a culturally safe script for them to be asking people if they'd like to self-identify. Because oftentimes, due to the trauma, discrimination, kind of the anxiety around people being asked that question, there's a way to ask the question so that it is less anxiety provoking, and people understand why they're being asked, that they're being asked so that they can benefit from having a culturally safe Indigenous service provider. So I'm sure that Waypoint is happy to share their script and their process. We've worked on that. We've met several times. We've tweaked it. And I think that we're really fortunate in that regard, that I believe that maybe the intake coordinator for Waypoint is actually a Métis woman herself. So she deeply understands. And then ensuring that there's adequate time during the intake to integrate culturally relevant practices. So we'd never just jump right in. There has to be time for, a little bit of relaxed conversation, maybe some ceremonies, like a smudging ceremony, or just visiting, relating and connecting. There has to be that opportunity to oftentimes, from an Indigenous approach, therapists are working from a spiritualized lens, which is very important as well. And you can't do that when you're in a rush. Spirit dictates that connection. And in my experience, if you try to rush, then you're actually going to slow down the process. So if you're going into if you're entering a session knowing that you're going to actually give the space and the opportunity to create that connection with spirit first, have a smudge, get grounded. We really promote a lot of practice of like mindfulness-based stress reduction, or like a meditative moment in the beginning of sessions, to help people ground and connect that way as well. So we're always providing opportunities for teaching and learning and encouraging that type of approach. All right, Kendall. Yeah, we did find, as I mentioned earlier, that we were having a hard time, I think, actually having clients meet the criteria because of the complexities. So we wanted to increase assessment time to allow for relationship building and a trauma-informed approach. So this is when we're doing our own referrals, our own internal referrals that aren't coming from the NLO, that we added on additional sessions in the beginning to allow time for that relationship building and establishing a healthy relationship or connection. And then consult with the community to better reflect what they feel is needed in the screening process. So this is something that is now currently underway with one of our CBT therapists who is taking on some of the lead work. And as she engages with the communities about the program and doing that socialization education, we're also just tweaking and defining that referral process or screening process. And also doing that in partnership with Waypoint as well. Lots of good feedback or lots of good discussion about that. And then when I talk about the need for a reduced caseload, this is often an issue that arises for Indigenous service providers. So we have providers who are going to communities. So in our region, we serve the Beausoleil First Nation. So this is an island community, and the CBT therapist was providing service over there. You have to drive to the ferry, get on the ferry. The ferry is, a 30-minute ride minimum, and then get settled into the community health center there, provide service all day, and then get back on the boat at the end of the day to make their way home. So we encourage virtual sessions where we can, but that's not always the best approach. And again, I think it's important to be having these discussions directly with the communities that you're partnering with or organizations that you're partnering with about when it's appropriate to be offering virtual or when it's absolutely necessary for a provider to be going into the community. So I think that that's just like a bigger picture issue, this adapt reporting process to reflect additional time needed to travel. Yeah. So when we look at our outcomes and, maybe not necessarily fitting the deliverables that you have to meet through the program, I think it's really important to also be adding in a qualitative report around that about why people are traveling to the community and why the caseloads are reduced and why they have to be reduced to make the program accessible. And then propose solutions for cultural approaches to healing within the existing framework. Yeah, so the reports from the therapist is obviously that there's a lot of writing that happens in a CBT session, a lot of worksheets and that type of thing. And that's not something that is done culturally. In Indigenous culture, healing is mostly held in the oral tradition, and it makes it difficult to disrupt the session to write. And so I think that what happens is over time, this is also speaks to sometimes the need for lengthening the treatment cycles somewhat, is that when you're building rapport relationship in the beginning, you can, connect orally, you can have that really nice, strong interaction where you're totally focused on the client, and then have discussions later about, at this stage of the therapy, I'm going to have to write some things down, and how do you feel about that? And really just having open dialogue about it, making sure that we're kind of reducing or actually eliminating that power imbalance. That's something that just is not going to work with Indigenous people. It's a cultural imperative that we all sit in the same circle. There's no hierarchy. And historically, through mainstream organizations, there's always been that power imbalance where service providers are often coming in with to help someone. And from a relationship perspective, or a trauma-informed approach, is that we sit in the same circle. There's no one above, there's no one below, and we have to be extremely aware of anything that appears to be that you're coming from a place of power in these relationships. Because if we're not, what happens is people are re-traumatized again. We have to heal within healthy, safe relationships. And allowing for enough time in the sessions to promote cultural healing approaches. We talked about that. Different practitioners, therapists will have their own specific approaches that they take. I mentioned earlier about, smudging at the beginning of a session. Some of the therapists may have different approaches that they use. They might they might be bringing drumming or singing or prayers or whatever into their sessions, and that's just a supportive tool, right? It's not just a supportive, it's actually an integral part of providing culturally relevant CBT in some cases. So these aren't things that we can write into a program and say, do this. But what we can do is to go back to that model with the sweetgrass and look at the center of the model and really focus and support that relationship, the safety of the relationship component between the therapist and the client. Yeah, I think that there was something there too about timing. It's hard because of the oral tradition and not really wanting to break the fluidity or the momentum of a session by breaking it up to write. That sometimes there has to be a little bit of additional reporting time to update notes after a session. Okay. And then the clinical companion document. So this was just something that we developed because we felt like there needed to be something written that was going to be, we talk a lot about making the program accessible to the community, but when we're sharing knowledge back about, what are our concerns or what are the barriers or why do you need lower case loads or more time or that type of thing, I think that there's also an opportunity there in terms of the context of two-eyed seeing to be communicating back. So trying to write or prepare and share documents that teach about why we're asking for this within a historical context and a cultural context. So this is why, so one example of that within the clinical companion document, it talks about the history of colonialism and the impact of that on Indigenous community members in accessing services such as therapy, and the power imbalance there and the lack of cultural safety. So the clinical documents sometimes were developed to address those kind of lack of understanding or awareness in a way that was relevant to Waypoint's needs. And within that clinical document came, providing context for why many clients may refuse to be recorded during a session. That some may be okay with it, but it would be up to the provider, the practitioner's discretion to know which clients to ask and which clients not to ask, and how to ask and when to ask. So that was important. And then other things like cadence, how to approach different types of language, making language more accessible, adapting a lot of the jargon to make it more accessible to people. So the clinical companion document outlined some of those things, and it was helpful. When you hit a stumbling block, for us, like as the Indigenous service providers, when we knew that we were hitting a wall with being able to communicate what we really meant, it was better just to step away, write a document, back it up with research and different specific scenarios so that people could understand. And it was a good approach. Okay, so this actually talks about some of the content in the clinical companion document. Talked about the establishment, like the differences between mainstream and Indigenous approaches to establishing a therapeutic relationship and what's essential for that. The changing of language and the need for changing of language in our approach with clients, and also the need for the Indigenous clinical consultation. So Dr. Levine and Dr. Connors. It also talks about how there needs to be an expansion of consultation time, and how it may not be appropriate with some clients. We'll know it won't be the best case scenario to be recording in a session or writing in a session. So that may have to happen afterwards. And then the intake process. I think this kind of goes back to ensuring that those who are going through, those who are implementing the intake process are aware of historical and contemporary context, but also for us in terms of being able to help the program be accessible. And when the program first came out, the pilot, it was called Increased Access to Structured Psychotherapy. And what we were finding was it wasn't accessible to most community members because they just weren't fitting the criteria. So we really had to take that into the historical and contemporary context into consideration to actually make the program accessible to people, and to ensuring that a trauma-informed approach was taken in the assessment process and, well, in the intake and the assessment process. And I can't really remember here, alternate pathway for, oh yes, okay, yes, we had a lot of discussion about this, and this goes on today, that as a recommendation going forward, and we still, move around this topic, we haven't quite landed on anything specific, but there is some really important work going on in the Indigenous community with different types of culturally relevant assessments that will potentially be very important moving forward to add into OSP into that process to be making sure that we're really assessing effectively and not assessing in a way that creates barriers for people to participate in the program. Again, it comes down to that meeting the criteria and the difference in how a mainstream organization might assess somebody's readiness over how an Indigenous organization might assess. So I think we have some work to do there, but I have a lot of faith in where we're going and how we're managing this, and you know, how it's all evolving for us in a really good way, in Mama Way in particular. And I think a lot of that has to do, again, too, with our, you know, our focus on an integrated approach. I touched on this earlier in terms of the adaptations around rural and remote communities. So you saw on the little map where I showed the population of 22,000 individuals in the region, Indigenous community members, that it's sprawling, right? So we have to take these things into consideration. If we're going to truly make it accessible to people, sometimes we have to travel. I talked about Beausoleil First Nation earlier as being in our region, and we're providing service for that community. And one of the other challenges there, and I'm very familiar with this, is that it's almost impossible to get a good internet connection there. People can't get a good internet connection in their homes. So sometimes what we have done in partnership with Beausoleil is have people set up in the community health center so they can come there for a virtual appointment and have better internet quality so they can participate from there. But you know, if we weren't in COVID and that type of thing, I think we would just be there. Like, we would be there. Even telephone sessions are not good. Just the internet and cell service is just not good quality. And that's a problem because that's a barrier for a community that has significant need in accessing equitable and relevant service. So when people in communities say they need to travel to a community, then they need to travel there, and they're for a variety of reasons. So you have to think about the time considerations around that in relation to caseloads. And then there's very limited public transportation infrastructure for people to be able to come for an appointment. I have clients from Beausoleil, if they were to travel for one appointment in the clinic with us, it's a whole day. It's a whole day experience. So I think it's really important to be making sure that you know your region and you know your area, you know the landscape. You've talked to Indigenous partners to really get a good sense of those things. Yeah, so just chatted about that. Adjust processes to accommodate needs, ensure assessments are culturally relevant and equitable. This is a huge work in progress here. While we in our clinic have our clinicians completing the GAD and the PHQ before they ever refer anybody. And we've done a lot of education in our clinic too, to really make sure that people are only referring when it's appropriate. Because we can have people coming for trauma therapy first, and then I can decide as you know, a therapist, when somebody's reached some degree of readiness for the OSP program, and then refer them on internally. But I think that this is one of the bigger needs that really needs to be addressed down the road. And I'm hoping that through our working relationship with Charity Fleming and Laurier University, that some good things may come from that or be developed from that in terms of appropriate assessment. And I know that Rennie Linklater from CAMH is on the line today, and she's done a great deal of work in terms of trauma, mental health, addictions, trauma assessment too, that's underway. So that may be something that is considered in the future too, as an integrated approach, a culturally relevant integrated approach. And we're doing this, we're growing the program with guidance from patients and communities. So because we're a regional service provider, so we are working with partners. We work with the health directors from the 4 different First Nations, and we work with urban Indigenous organizations, and those communities and programs will continue to guide how we work together and serve them best, providing CBT. And that's it. Are we done? Yeah, we're done. Good. So we're at questions. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer. Can I let you field those for me?
Yeah,
Kendall?
absolutely. I'm actually going to take down the slides so we can see everybody, those who have their cameras off. And I just want to start by, on behalf of everyone, thanking you so much, Leah, for your time and sharing all of these learnings on behalf of your partners, and for the Waypoint team as well. And there's so much to take away. And I've heard these lessons, not directly from you, but in different ways and different reports, probably a dozen times. And I still picked up some new stuff today that I didn't quite appreciate before. So this has been extremely valuable. I am taking a quick look at the chat right now. It's just a whole bunch of beautiful thank yous to you, Leah. No questions so far, but I want to welcome anybody to take themselves off mute, ask questions. Also, from the NLOs that have started some of this work in your own regions, if you want to add any additional learnings from your contexts, yeah, I'll turn it over to all of you as participants.
Thank you so much for having me. And it was my pleasure. And I'm always really excited and grateful when others are taking away some of these learnings and looking to establish some of these really good relationships with the community and making services more accessible.
So we have our first hand raised. Ambika, you want to go ahead?
Hi, everyone. Hi, Leah. Thank you so much. That was such an amazing presentation, and the work that you've done with your partners is just fantastic. It's so inspiring to hear this. My question is just around, and maybe this is an Ontario Health response as well, but I know a lot of the regional groups, NLOs, are going to be developing long-term relationships with their own Indigenous partners so that they can develop something similar to what you've done, because I think you said, you know, it should really be developed by the community for their communities. But just given a lot of the great work that you've done and all the learnings and the length of time it's probably going to take to implement it in the other regions, I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to leverage the infrastructure you've already built to help support perhaps communities right now in the short term who may be looking for OSP specific Indigenous support while these more long-term relationships and infrastructure is being developed in other areas of the province. I hope that's clear.
I thought I had it there for a moment, but then I was like, maybe I'm misunderstanding. So just let me confirm.
Okay.
Are you asking if it's okay to share our evaluative report from the pilot and just discuss some of the information and approaches that we've been able to glean from our experience with other communities and other regions?
I think what you've shared here is great, but I'm just wondering, and Jess and I have had some conversations in the past a little bit about this, but is there an opportunity to have other participants from other areas? So I know this is very specific to North Simcoe Muskoka and your community, but while the Indigenous OSP programs are being developed across the province, because that work hasn't yet begun, is there an opportunity to support other participants from outside of the North Simcoe Muskoka?
Oh. Do you mean clients?
Yes.
Oh,
Yes.
oh, no, I don't think so. Our therapists are very busy. I don't think that we have we wouldn't have the capacity to take on others from outside our region, I don't think. Maybe that could be something that's discussed at an NLO to NLO basis, and they can be checking in on our current caseloads. But I think that our therapists are pretty busy, but maybe chat with Waypoint about that. Does that make sense? Jess? I see you nodding. Yeah, okay.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
Okay, thanks, Ambika. Peter.
Oh, yeah, hi. Leah, thanks for that. Great, really great. I have a very specific question, perhaps a bit narrow, but appreciate if you could let us know or let me know. In the delivery of the service of CBT, has there been a need to do it in the language? So you mentioned Anishinaabe, I think, so that would be Ojibwe, I believe. Has that need arisen, or is it mostly done in English?
I think that it's probably a very important consideration for future as it expands. You know, I think from our perspective, we've been hoping that eventually we would have an Indigenous NLO, you know, or oversight that would be reaching, you know, further into more northern regions. But in our region, it has not been possible to be providing CBT in the language, and most people are using English to
Okay.
deliver the program. But
Great.
there are communities that would benefit from speakers, you know, CBT therapists being able to provide service in the language.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. I just saw a message from Rennie Kendall. Can you read that?
Yeah, Rennie was just linking for everyone the link to the OSP Knowledge Exchange event with Indigenous partners that took place, I think almost 2 years ago. If someone wants to remind me if that was in February or March of 2020, right before the pandemic hit, because I believe it was in person. But thank you, Rennie, for sharing that link. We can share it around again via email to everyone as well after.
Really important question. You know, I don't want to minimize that at all. But that's a really important part of the healing process overall, is for people to be able to access services in their language. This is, from a broader perspective, language is just generally important for people to be healing deeply. As a trauma, you know, somebody who focuses their work on trauma and embodiment and somatic processing, I've seen pretty incredible things happen for people when they do learn their own language, because there is a a different vibration to the language that really resonates on a cellular level. And people become very healthy and very empowered when they're speaking their own language.
Would agree. We are very keen for, I'm one of the clinical consultants for OH West. That would be something we would be very keen to sort of follow up on. Yeah, thanks.
I'm not seeing any other hands at the moment. Apologies if I'm missing you. But anyone, please feel free to go ahead if you have a question or a comment.
I just wanted to unmute for a moment just to say thank you so much to Leah for the wonderful presentation. And just to say that I echo Leah's sentiments about the productive nature of our partnership and the valuable relationships that we've formed. So it's been such a pleasure working with our Indigenous partners.
Thanks, Jess.
Maybe I'll just echo that as well, and just to say, I mean, thank you first off so much, Leah. I've like Kendall had the opportunity to learn from you and Jermaine on several occasions and read your evaluative case study, but each time I learned some more, and I think there's just so much shared today that I think we can all just really reflect on. So thank you. I appreciate it so much. And I also just want to, as I've shared with this group earlier, do want to emphasize how excited we are. We're going to have an OSP Indigenous clinical lead in place within the next few months, who will be able to, really take a lead on getting this work going. Rennie and Laura are here from Shkabe Makwa, who have also been supporting some of the early work on this. And we've also got our colleagues at IPHCC who are supporting this. So a lot of the work is in place, and we're really excited about it. But certainly, the work you, Leah, and colleagues have done has set the bar high in terms of where the program can go. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you. And again, the work continues on. I really feel like Momaway has been a great little incubator for being able to practice and to have these great partnerships that have been allowing us to try different things and to hear us when we bring issues to the table and to work with us in such a productive and collaborative and respectful way. And I'm very, very excited about the work that we're going to be doing with Charity Fleming's help. And I just hope that this program can go on to expand to become accessible to clients and community members, all throughout the province in different areas and regions. And I'm very hopeful for it. We have a beautiful vision, and I really hope that we get there. We get there in a very, a timely manner. There was a very, very high need prior to COVID. A lot of underfunding for resources, lack of access, and complexity of situations, so much trauma. And, COVID has just put another layer of concern on top of it, on top of everybody's mental health and well-being. So I'm just really hoping that we can create something that is valuable and beneficial and helpful and healing for many, many years to come. So thanks again for having me.
Thanks, Leah. And I also wanted to, I know we've expressed this directly to you and to the Indigenous Evaluation Circle as well, but a lot of the work that you and the partners and Waypoint have done has really made its way into some of the early thinking about broader health equity issues in OSP as well. And I hope for those that have been part of kind of the review and consultation and early development of the OSP health equity maturity model, you'll see yourselves in there and a lot of the concepts that you've been able to articulate through your partnership, through your work, through your community of practice, your companion guide have been making its way into the broader thinking around health equity and accessibility and issues we need to tackle. To better meet the needs of individuals in what is a structured provincial program that's trying to achieve a certain level of standardization while balancing the needs of many unique groups and people.
Great. That's it. I'm done if there's no more questions.
We'll give everybody 30 seconds. If there's no other questions, we will gift everyone 10 minutes back in your day. And thanks again for taking the time to join, and really looking forward to continuing these conversations across the program. Peter, I just want to make sure that you don't have another question, that your hand is just still up from your first question.
No, I'm just terrible at WebEx.
Perfect. That's great.
Sorry.
Me too. Great.
Okay, thanks so much, everyone. We will share
Thanks,
out
everyone.
the links from the chat. We'll share the slides, and when the recording's ready, we'll circulate that as well. Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye-bye.